Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple of different reasons. The first of which is just to take my brain out of motive background work over the course of the week and move into the process of writing and preparing the sermon that I'm going to preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason that I do these. And the second reason, just to allow you, the viewer who have come across this video for whatever brought you here today, to gain some insight into the assigned text for the week. So that's why I do these. This particular Sunday, which is February 18th, 2018, to 1818, kind of makes me chuckle because I like numbers, which is weird. Anyway, getting back on track. The first Sunday in Lent, rather than preaching out of the gospel this week, which is a continuation of parts of Mark chapter 1. We've been in Mark a lot lately, or Mark chapter 1 a lot, and we jumped ahead a week ago on Transfiguration Sunday into chapter 9. Now we're jumping back into chapter 1 again. So that is what the gospel text is. Speaks a little bit about Jesus' baptism and then overlaps with the very brief passage about the 40 days of temptation in the wilderness. Mark is a very, very, very brief with that. It's only a couple of verses long. Basically says that it happens, that Jesus is out in the wilderness where he is tempted, and then glosses over and moves on into the next thing. But that being said, I'm not preaching out of the gospel this week. I'm going to preach out of the Old Testament lesson, which is part of the story of Noah following the flood. It's the story of the covenant that God makes, or that God establishes with Noah and with future generations and with all life. If there's a theme that kind of emerges with our Old Testament texts this year in the season of Lent, it's this theme of covenant, that God establishes promises with groups of people or with individuals or with all people or in different situations. And so in the very least this week and probably moving forward through the season, that's what I'm going to focus on. Just seems to be a good thing to look at this time around. Anyway, that's what I'm doing this week. Anyway, so a word about Lent as we move. If you caught my last video, which was earlier this week for Ash Wednesday, of course, kicks off the season of Lent. Lent is a season of, I tend to call it a season of preparation as we move towards Holy Week and as we move towards the remembrance of Jesus' last days and his death and his resurrection. As we move towards Holy Week and Easter, that's what we're preparing for. Sometimes you'll hear that Lent is a dark season. I know I've said that in the past, which strikes me as kind of funny as I look over my shoulder and here's this bright light, bright sunny day as it's streaming in through my window, and I talk about it being a dark season. Perhaps that's fitting, considering the events that have happened on Ash Wednesday. Probably goes without saying that their news broke of another school shooting in Florida, and at last count, 17 or perhaps 18 people have died because of that. And it's another senseless act of violence, a senseless act of anger and hatred. And I'm not going to politicize it. I'm not going to say it one way or the other. There's enough of that going on, but it's a senseless tragedy, and it's evidence of this broken world that we live in and this tendency towards destruction that seems to be a part of the broken human existence. And that is perhaps, I don't even like that this is coming out of my mouth. I'm about to say that it's almost fitting considering what we're talking about here with the flood and the aftermath of the flood. But make no mistake, I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that there's anything good about this at all. It's horrible. It's senseless. It's happening too much. One time is too many times, and I've lost count. And it sickens me. That being said, I want to jump towards the reading. Now, the actual reading comes from Genesis 9, verses 8 through 17, and this is very close to the end of Noah's story. Noah's story actually kicks off about 3 chapters earlier. As we move, first there's a brief genealogy as we hear about the generations, starting with Adam and then Seth, who is the third son of Adam and Eve after Cain and Abel, and then the descendants on down till we get to Noah, and it's 10 generations that are between God's good creation that God calls very good in the creation of humanity, because humanity is made bearing the divine image of God. And so in 10 generations, we've gone from Tov, which is a Hebrew word that my congregation's used to hearing me talk about, to God being sorry that he has created life, that he has created humanity, because life has twisted, and it's evil, and it's destructive. So I think that's an important point to make as we move towards the story of the flood and then beyond it to the covenant that God makes, that we tend to think of the Old Testament God as full of wrath and full of anger, and yet the what's the word I'm looking for? The reason behind the flood is not God's wrath, it is God's sorrow, it is God's grief for the state that the world has found itself in. Now, we could argue one way or the other, the world is as God made it, or the world is broken because of the presence of sin. I'm not going to get into that, but in 10 generations, we've gone from God saying this is very good to God sorry that he has created life as it is, or sorry for the state of life as it is, maybe is a better way to say it. But so that's where things are, and yet Noah is found to be righteous. And so Noah and his sons and their wives and the animals are saved because God says from the get-go, I will make a covenant with you. And essentially that first step of the covenant is that you will be saved. This remnant, your family, and the animals that you bring with you will be saved when the rest of life is destroyed. And then the flood happens, and of course the flood itself is a story that tends to be well known, and oftentimes we think of it almost as a nursery story. And we find the ark and the rainbows and all of that in our children's ministry areas, and in every storybook Bible it's in there, and it's usually depicted as something nice, but it's not. It's the destruction of the earth. And the flood lasted for a year. They were on the ark for a year. If we look through the story, we find that. So this is no small thing. But then, following the flood, once the flood water has dried up, God tells Noah, come out of the ark. Noah and all the animals and Noah's family come out of the ark. And essentially, we then hear God say, be fruitful and multiply. So the very same thing that God said to Adam and Eve in the creation of humanity, be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth. We hear the same thing again. So one could say theologically, this is another new, I don't know if we want to call it another new creation, a second creation. That's not really right, but and maybe it's also not quite right to say it's a reset button. But regardless, we see that God's grief, God's cleansing of the world, still does not negate that first good creation. And God remembers it, and so God establishes a covenant. Now, I've been talking for almost 9 minutes. How about we actually read this? As I read it, I want you to consider what repeats in here. Repetition is important, particularly in the Old Testament scriptures. But when you hear something repeated, that means it's important. So again, this is picking up in chapter 9, verses 8 through 17. This is post-flood, the covenant that God is making. God said to Noah and to his sons with him, as for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, there it is again, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and between every living creature that is with you for all future generations. Pause. Did you catch that? This is an ongoing covenant for all future generations. And it's not just between God and Noah. It's not just between God and Noah's sons, but it's for all generations and it's all life. And that's worth noting, that this is a covenant that God has made with all creation, essentially. Okay, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh on the earth. All right, so that's the reading. Now, we tend to think of the rainbow as it's the sign of the promise that God has made, that God will never flood the earth again, that God will never destroy the earth and all life through the waters of the flood again. And that's important. It is a sign for us. But what I love about this covenant is that typically when we think of a covenant, it's an agreement between two parties and they each bring something to the table. This is a one-sided covenant, if you caught that. God asks nothing of Noah and the people. God only says, I bind myself through this covenant that never again will I destroy the earth through the waters of the flood again. And the sign will be the bow, the rainbow. Now, we tend to think of rainbows as beautiful. We tend to think of rainbows as a gorgeous thing. And I'm right on top of that. I love rainbows. They're beautiful, beautiful things. And rainbows are very meaningful for me just personally because of seeing them when my family and I go to family camp in the mountains of Colorado. And it's very common in the afternoon for rain clouds to come rolling down the mountain, which faces to the west, out into the valley, which goes to the east, and it'll rain very heavily for just a few minutes, and then those clouds roll right on down, and the sun comes back out behind the clouds and down the mountain, and so you get these gorgeous rainbows that as you look out over this beautiful mountain valley to the next range that's beyond it. I've seen it more times than I can count, and it's a wonderful, wonderful sight. But when I think of the bow, as it's talked about here, for us, it's a beautiful thing, and it's a reminder of the promise, and that's all good. I don't negate that. But think of it, and I never really did this until this week, think of it as the bow of a hunter. And this is an image that is important, that goes way, way back into early civilization, that it was thought that God or the gods, this is kind of ranges across different cultures, but that lightning was arrows that were being shot by a god, whether it's God or a different culture's gods, small g, that was being shot down at the earth. That it was destruction, it was vengeance, it was violence on the part of a divine being. And God is saying, I will hang my bow in the clouds. And if we think about it, the shape of a bow arching down, if you think about a hunting bow, that means that it's arching down, it's not strung, it's not pulled taut, and it's pointing away from the target. If the lightning was arrows that a divine being was shooting at the earth for the purpose of destruction, God is saying, I hang my bow, I'm hanging it up, I'm not going to use it anymore. This is a sign of the promise. My bow, my article of destruction, you want to use that term, is hanging up and never again will be pointed down at you for the purpose of destruction. That's the promise. Never again will I destroy the earth through the waters of the flood. I hang it up, and it's a sign for me, God, when I see it, I will remember, and it's a sign for you to remember the promise that I have made to you. I think a lot about this in terms of this one-sided covenant that God has made the promise. God binds God's self to never go through destruction again. And yet, when I say things like a one-sided covenant, or when I talk about things that there's nothing that we can do to get to God, I believe all this is true. We are broken, flawed beings. And yet we are still made bearing the divine image of God. I love in the story of the creation that we hear that we are invited into the work of creation with God, particularly in the second account in Genesis chapter 2, when God brings the animals to the man and says, what will you call them? We are invited into the work of creation. We are invited now through the Holy Spirit empowering us into this body of Christ to be the body here on earth, to act in such a way that brings about the kingdom of heaven in our broken reality now. I talk about this a lot, and this is really in my head right now. Um, I've spoken before about a four step or 4 chapter story of existence. We want to use that. God made it. Humanity messed it up. Christ redeemed it, and we are invited into the work of reconciling the world back to God. I feel very strongly we are invited into this work, not to earn ourselves anything, but out of response to what God has done, what God has promised, what God has done on our behalf. Oftentimes when I'm teaching a baptismal class, I talk about how water accomplishes amazing things through the water of baptism. And yet water also accomplishes some devastating things, and the flood is a perfect account of that. Life was destroyed in the power of the flood. And if you've ever seen floods, you see how destructive they are. I think back to Hurricane Katrina down in New Orleans, 10, 11, 12 odd years ago, and the destruction that happened from that. We've seen it, tsunamis, whatever. Water is amazingly destructive, and yet it does amazing things. And because of that, the flood is sometimes considered to be a precursor to baptism, to the waters of our baptism, that God cleansed the earth, just as in other waters of our baptism, we are cleansed of our the consequences of our broken sin. And that's a physical thing that we hold on to, a physical sign that we hold on to of the promise that God has made. That's what baptism is. And I think also what Holy Communion is. That's what makes them sacramental, that they are a physical sign of the promise that God has made to you. And that goes along very much so with this idea of a bow being a weapon of destruction being hung up, that no longer will God destroy us. But that doesn't take away our own destructive capacity. And maybe I'll just leave it with this in light of yet another tragedy. We can be better. We must be better. I'm not saying what the answer is. I have my own opinions that probably differ from yours, or maybe they're in line with yours. But regardless, God invites us into the work of creation, into the work of bringing about that which is good, that which is holy, that which is a positive thing, a light that shines in the darkness of all this bullshit that keeps on happening. So if you have thoughts, questions, comments about the text, please share those down in the comment section. Note, I'm not interested in starting a debate with you politically if we happen to fall on opposite sides of the coin. So if you're going to comment, please refrain from any of that. Otherwise, please have a blessed week. May God be with you today and every day.